French lesson. When Sara entered the schoolroom the next day, everybody looks at her with wide, interested eyes. By that time, every pupil, from Lavanya Herbert, who was nearly 13, and felt quite grown up, to Lottie Lee, who was only just 4 and the baby of the school, had heard a great deal about her, about Sara. They knew very certainly that she was Miss Munchin's show pupil and was considered a credit to the establishment. 1 or 2 of them had even caught a glimpse of her French maid, Mariette, who had arrived the evening before. Lavanya had managed to pass Sara's room when the door was open, and had seen Mariette opening a box which had arrived late from some shop. It was full of petticoats with lace frills on them. "Frills and frills," she whispered to her friend Jessie as she bent over her geography. "I saw her shaking them out. I heard Miss Munchin say to Miss Amelia that her clothes were so grand that they were ridiculous for a child. My mamma says that children should be dressed simply, and she's got one of those petticoats on right now. I saw it when she sat down." "She has silk stockings on," whispered Josie, bending over her geography also. "And what little feet! I never saw such little feet." "Oh," sniffed Lavanya spitefully. "That is the way her slippers are made. My mamma says that even big feet can be made to look small if you have a clever shoemaker. I don't think she's pretty at all. Her eyes are such a queer color." "She isn't pretty as other pretty people are," said Jessie, stealing a glance from across the room. "But she makes you want to look at her." Again. "She has tremendously long eyelashes, but her eyes are almost green." Sara was sitting quietly in her seat, waiting to be told what to do. She had been placed near Miss Munchin's desk. She was not abashed at all by the many pairs of eyes watching her. She was interested, and looked back quietly at the children who looked at her. She wondered what they were thinking of, and if they liked Miss Munchin, and if they cared for their lessons, or if any of them had a papa at all like her own. She had had a long talk with Emily about her papa that morning. "He's on the sea now, Emily," she had said. "We must be great friends to each other and tell each other things. Emily, look at me. You have got the nicest eyes I ever saw, but I wish you could speak." She was a child full of imaginings and whimsical thoughts, and one of her fancies was that there would be a great deal of comfort even in pretending that Emily was alive and really heard and understood. After Mariette had dressed her in her dark blue schoolroom frock and tied her hair with a dark blue ribbon, she went to Emily, who sat on a chair of her own, and gave her a book. "You can read that while I'm downstairs," she said, and seeing Mariette looking at her curiously, she spoke to her with a serious face. "What I believe about dolls," she said, "is that they can do things that they will not let us know about. Perhaps, really, Emily can read and talk and walk, but she will only do it when people are out of the room. It's her secret. You see, if people knew that dolls could do things, they would make them work. So, perhaps they promised each other to keep it a secret. If you stay in the room, Emily will just sit there and stare. But if you go out, she will begin to read. Perhaps go and look out the window. And then if she heard either of us coming, she would just run back and jump back into her chair and pretend that she'd been there the whole time." "Come esta la strola," Mariette said to herself as she went downstairs. She told the head, and when she went downstairs, she told the head housemaid about it. But she had already begun to like this odd little girl who had such an intelligent small face and such perfect manners. She'd taken care of children before who were not so polite. Sara was a very fine little person, and had a gentle, appreciative way of saying, "If you please, Mariette. Thank you, Mariette," which was very charming. Mariette told the head housemaid that she thanked her as if she were thanking a lady. Elle a l'air d'une princesse petite, she said. Indeed, she was very much pleased with her new little mistress, and liked her place greatly. After Sara had sat in her seat in the schoolroom for a few minutes, she began, being looked at by the pupils. Miss Munchin rapped in a dignified manner upon her desk. "Children, please get into your old seats. I got to teach." Oh, sorry. "Young ladies," she said, "I wish to introduce you to your new companion." And all the little girls rose in their places, and Sara rose also. "I shall expect you all to be very agreeable to Miss Crewe. She has just come to us from a great distance, in fact, from India. As soon as lessons are over, you must each make each other's acquaintance." The pupils bowed ceremoniously, and Sara made a little curtsy, and then they sat down and looked at each other again. "Sara," said Miss Munchin in her schoolroom manner, "come here to me." She had taken a book from the desk, and was turning over its leaves. Sara went to her politely. "As your papa has arranged a French maid for you," she began, "I conclude that he wishes you to make a special study of the French language." Sara felt a little awkward. I think he engaged her," she said, "because he thought I would like her, Miss Munchin." "I'm afraid," said Miss Munchin, with a slightly sour smile, "that you have been a very spoiled little girl, and always imagine that things are done because you like them. My impression is that your papa wished you to learn French." If Sara had been older, or less particular about being quite polite to people, she would have explained herself in very few words. But as it was, she felt a flush rising on her cheeks. Miss Munchin was a very severe and imposing person, and she seemed so absolutely sure that Sara knew nothing whatever of French that she felt as if she would almost be rude to correct her. Well, the truth was that Sara could not remember a time when she had not seemed to know French. Her father had often spoken it to her when she had been a baby. Her mother had been a Frenchwoman, and Captain Crewe had loved her language. So it happened that Sara always heard and been familiar with it. I never really learned French, but she began, trying shyly to make herself clear. One of Miss Munchin's chief secret annoyances was that she did not speak French herself. It was desirous of concealing the irritating fact. She therefore had no intention of discussing the matter, and laying herself open to innocent questioning by a new pupil. Okay. She wasn't going to be questioned by Miss Munchin. And Miss Munchin wanted to know French, but she had trouble learning it. And she was the autorité, and Sara was the little child. "That is enough," she said with polite tartness. "If you have not learned, you must begin at once. The French master, Monsieur Dufarge, will be here in a few minutes. Take this book and look at it until he arrives." Sara's cheeks felt warm. She went back to her seat and opened the book. She looked at the first page with a grave face. She knew it would be rude to smile, but she was very determined to not be rude, and she was very determined to not be rude. But it was very odd to find herself expected to study a page which told her that le père meant father, and la mère meant the mother. Miss Munchin glanced toward her scrutinizingly. "Well, you look rather cross, Sara," she said. "I am sorry that you do not like the idea of learning French." "I'm very fond of it," answered Sara, thinking she would try again. "But—" "You must not say 'but' when you are told to do things," said Miss Munchin. "Look at your book again." And Sara did so, and did not smile, even when she found that la fille means the son, and le frère meant the brother. "When Monsieur Defarge comes," she thought, "I can make him understand." Monsieur Defarge arrived very shortly afterward. He was a very nice, intelligent, middle-aged Frenchman, and he looked interested when his eyes fell upon Sara, trying politely to seem absorbed in her little book of phrases. "Is this the new pupil for me, madame?" he had said to Miss Munchin. "I hope this is my very good fortune. I hope this is my good fortune." Her papa, Captain Crewe, is very anxious that she should begin the language, but I'm afraid she has a childish prejudice against it. She does not seem to wish to learn," said Miss Munchin. "I'm sorry of that, mademoiselle," he said kindly to Sara. "Perhaps, when we begin studying together, I may show you that it is quite a charming tongue." Little Sara rose in her seat. She was beginning to feel rather desperate, as if she were almost in disgrace, and she looked up to Monsieur Defarge's face with her big grey-green eyes, and they were quite innocently appealing. She knew that he would understand as soon as she spoke. She began to explain quite simply, in pretty and fluent French. Madame is not understood. She had not learned French exactly, not out of books, but her papa and other people had always spoken it to her, and she had read it and written it, as she had read and written English. Her papa loved it, and she loved it because he did. Her dear mamma, who had died when she was born, had been French. She would be glad to learn anything Monsieur would teach her, but what she had tried to explain to Madame is that she already knew the words in this book, as she held out the little book of phrases. When she began to speak, Miss Munchin stared quite violently, and sat staring at her over her eyeglasses almost indignantly, until she had finished. Monsieur Defarge began to smile, and his smile was one of great pleasure. To hear this pretty childish voice speaking his own language so simply and charmingly made him feel almost as if he were in his native land, in which dark foggy days of London seemed worlds away. When she had finished, he took the phrase book from her, and with a look almost affectionate, Betty spoke to Miss Munchin. "Ah, madame," she said, "there is not much I can teach her. She has not learned French. She is French. Her accent is exquisite." "You ought to have told me," exclaimed Miss Munchin, much mortified, turning on Sara. I tried," said Sara. I suppose I had not began right." Miss Munchin knew she had tried, and that it had not been her fault that she was not allowed to explain. But when she saw that the pupils had been listening, and that Lavanya and Jessie were giggling behind their French grammars, she felt infuriated. "Silence, young ladies," she said severely, rapping upon the desk now. "Silence at once, I'll bite you in the buns. Silence at once, or I'll beat you on the buns." Oh, sorry. I told you, you have a very funny family. But you shouldn't be rapping. Silence at once. and she began from that minute to feel rather a grudge against her new show pupil. Well, that was only 15 minutes. I think maybe, let's see. Oh, hell yeah. Chapter 3. On that first morning, when Sara sat at Miss Munchin's side, aware that the whole schoolroom was devoting itself to observing her, she had noticed very soon one little girl, about her own age, who looked at her very hard with a pair of light, rather dull blue eyes. She was a fat child, who did not look as if she were in the least clever, but she had a good-naturedly pouting mouth. Her flaxen hair was braided in a tight pigtail, tied with a ribbon, and she had pulled this pigtail around her neck, and was biting the end of the ribbon, resting her elbows on the desk, as she stared wonderingly at the new pupil. When Monsieur Defarge began to speak to Sara, she looked a little frightened, and when Sara stepped forward, looking at him with the innocent, appealing eyes, and answered him without any warning in French, the fat little girl gave a startled jump, and grew quite red in her awed amazement. Having wept hopeless tears for weeks in her efforts to remember that la mère meant the mother, and le père meant the father, when one spoke sensible English, it was almost too much for her to suddenly find herself listening to a child of her own age who seemed not only familiar with these words, but apparently knew any number of others, and could mix them up with verbs as if they were mere trifles. She stared so hard and bit the bottom of her ribbon on her pigtail so fast that she attracted the attention of Miss Munchin, who, feeling extremely cross at the moment, immediately pounced upon her. "Miss St. John," she exclaimed severely, "what do you mean by such conduct? Remove your elbows. Take that ribbon out of your mouth. Sit up at once." Upon which Miss St. John gave another jump, and when Lavinia and Jessie tittered, she became redder than ever, so red, indeed, that she almost looked as if the tears were coming into her poor, dull, childish eyes. And Sara saw her, and was so sorry for her, and she began to rather like her and want to be her friend. It was a way of hers, always to want to spring into any fray in which someone was made uncomfortable or unhappy. If Sara had been a boy and lived centuries ago, her father used to say, she would have gone about the country with her sword drawn, rescuing and defending everyone in distress. She always wants to fight when she sees people in trouble, her father said. So she took rather a fancy to fat, slow, little Miss St. John, and kept glancing toward her through the morning. She saw the lessons were no easy matter for her, and that she was in no danger of ever being spoiled by being treated as a show pupil. Her French lesson was a pathetic thing. Her pronunciation made even Monsieur Defarge smile in spite of himself, and Lavinia and Jessie and the more fortunate girls either giggled or looked at her in wondering disdain. But Sara did not laugh. She tried to look as if she did not hear when Miss St. John called La Bonne Pan, Lee Bong Pang. She had a fine, hot little temper of her own, and it made her feel rather savage when she heard the titters and saw the poor, stupid, distressed child's face. "It isn't funny, really," she said between her teeth, as she bent over her book. "They ought not to laugh." When the lessons were over, and the pupils gathered together in groups to talk, Sara looked for Miss St. John, and finding her bundled rather disconsolately in a window-seat, she walked over to her and spoke. She'd only said the kind of thing little girls always say to each other by way of beginning an acquaintance, but there was something nice and friendly about Sara, and people always felt it. "What's your name?" she said. To explain Miss St. John's amazement, one must recall that a new pupil is, for a short time, somewhat uncertain thing. And of this new pupil, the entire school had talked the night before until it fell asleep, quite exhausted by the excitement and contradictory stories. A new pupil, with a carriage and a pony and a maid and a voyage from India to discuss, was not an ordinary experience or an ordinary acquaintance. "My name's Ermengarde St. John," she answered. "Mine is Sara Crewe," said Sara. "Yours is very pretty. It sounds like a storybook." "Do you like it?" fluttered Ermengarde. I like yours." Miss St. John's chief trouble in life was that she had a clever father. Sometimes this seemed to her to instill dreadful calamity. If you have a father who knows everything, who speaks 7 or 8 languages, has thousands of volumes which he has apparently learned by heart, he frequently expresses to you to be familiar with the contents of your lesson books, at least. And it is not improbable that he will feel you ought to be able to remember a few incidents of history and to write a French exercise. Ermengarde was a severe trial to Mr. St. John. He could not understand how a child of his could be notably and unmistakably a dull creature, who never shone in anything. Poor baby. Poor Ermengarde. "Good heavens," he had said more than once, as he stared at her. "There are times when I think she is as stupid as her Aunt Eliza." If her Aunt Eliza had been slow to learn and quick to forget a thing entirely when she learned it, Ermengarde was strikingly like her. She was the monumental dunce of the school, and it could not be denied. "She must be made to learn," her father said to Miss Munchin. Consequently, Ermengarde spent the greater part of her life in disgrace or in tears. She learned things and forgot them, or, if she remembered them, she did not understand them. So it was natural that, having made Sara's acquaintance, she should sit and stare at her with profound admiration. "You can speak French, can't you?" she said respectfully. Sara got onto the window seat, which was a big, deep one, and tucking up her feet, sat with her hands clasped around her knees. "I can speak it because I heard it all my life," she answered. You could speak it as if you always heard it." "Oh, no, I couldn't," said Ermengarde. "I never could speak it." "Why?" inquired Sara curiously. Ermengarde shook her head so that the pigtail wobbled. "You heard me just now," she said. "I'm always like that. I can't say the words. They're so queer." She paused a moment, and then added with a touch of awe in her voice, You are clever, aren't you?" Sara looked out the window into the dingy square, where the sparrows were hopping and twittering on the wet iron railings and the steep branches of the trees. She reflected a few moments. She had heard it said very often that she was clever, and she wondered if she was. And if she was, how had it happened? "I don't know," she said. "I can't tell." Then, seeing a mournful look on the round, chubby face, she gave a little laugh and changed the subject. "Would you like to see Emily?" she inquired. Who's Emily?" Ermengarde asked, just as Miss Munchin had done. "Come up to my room and see," said Sara, holding out her hand. They jumped down from the window seat together and went upstairs. "Is it true?" Ermengarde whispered as they went through the halls. "Is it true that you have a playroom all to yourself?" "Yes," Sara answered. "Papa asked Miss Munchin to let me have one because, well, it was because when I play I make up stories and tell them to myself, and I don't like people to hear me. It spoils it if I think people listen." They had reached the passage leading to Sara's room by this time, and Ermengarde stopped short, staring, quite losing her breath. "You make up stories?" she gasped. "Can you do that? As well as speak French? Can you?" She looked up at her in simple surprise. "Why, anyone can make up things," she said. "Have you never tried?" She put her hand warningly on Ermengarde's. "Let's go very quietly to the door," she whispered, "and then I will open it quite suddenly, and perhaps we may catch her." She was still half laughing, but there was a touch of mysterious hope in her eyes which fascinated Ermengarde, although she had not the remotest idea what it meant, or whom it was she wanted to catch, or why she wanted to catch her. Whatsoever she meant, Ermengarde was sure it was something delightfully exciting. So, quite thrilled with expectation, she followed her on tiptoe along the passage. They made not the least noise until they reached the door. Sara suddenly turned the handle and threw it wide open. Its opening revealed a room quite neat and quiet, a fire gently blazing in the grate, and a wonderful doll sitting in a chair by it, apparently reading a book. "Oh, she got back to her seat before we could see her," Sara exclaimed. "Of course they always do. They're quick as lightning." Ermengarde looked from her to the doll and back again. "Can she walk?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes," answered Sara. "At least I believe she can. At least I pretend I believe she can. And that makes it seem as if it were true. Have you never pretended things?" "No," said Ermengarde. "Never. Tell me about it." She was so bewitched by this odd new companion that she actually stared at Sara instead of at Emily, notwithstanding that Emily was the most attractive doll person she'd ever seen. "Let us sit down," said Sara, "and I will tell you. It's so easy that when you begin you can't stop. You just go on, doing it always. And it's beautiful. Emily, you must listen. This is Ermengarde St. John. Emily. Ermengarde, this is Emily. Would you like to hold her?" "Oh, may I?" said Ermengarde. "May I really? She is beautiful." And Emily was put into her arms. Never in her dull, short life had Miss St. John dreamed of such an hour as the one she spent with the queer new pupil before they heard the lunch bell ring, and they were obliged to go downstairs. Sara sat upon the hearth rug and told her strange things. She sat rather huddled up, and her green eyes shone and her cheeks flushed. She told stories of the voyage and stories of India, but what fascinated Ermengarde the most was her fancy about the dolls who walked and talked, and who could do anything they chose when the human beings were out of the room, but who must keep their powers a secret, and so flew back to their places like lightning when people returned to the room. "We couldn't do it," Sara said seriously. "You see, it's a kind of magic." Once, when she was relating the story of the search for Emily to Ermengarde, Ermengarde saw her face suddenly change. A cloud seemed to pass over it and put out the light in her shining eyes. She drew her breath in so sharply that it made a funny, sad little sound. And she shut her lips and held them tightly closed, as if she were determined either to do or not to do something. Ermengarde had an idea that if she'd have been like any other girl, she might have suddenly burst out sobbing and crying, but she did not. "Have you a pain?" Ermengarde ventured. "Yes," Sara answered after a moment's silence. "But it is not in my body." Then she added something in a low voice which she tried to keep quiet and steady, and it was, "Do you love your father more than anything else in the whole world?" Ermengarde's mouth fell open a little. She knew it would be far from behaving like a respectable child at a select seminary to say that it never occurred to you that you could love your father, that you would do anything desperate to avoid being left alone in his society for 10 minutes. She was, indeed, greatly embarrassed. I scarcely ever see him," she stammered. "He's always in the library, reading things." "I love mine more than all the world 10 times over," Sara said. "That is what my pain is. He's gone away." She put her head quietly down on her little huddled-up knees and sat very still for a few moments. "She's going to cry out loud," thought Ermengarde, fearfully, but she did not. Her short black locks tumbled about her ears as she sat still. She then spoke without lifting her head. "I promised him I would bear it," she said, "and I will. You have to bear things. Think what soldiers bear. Papa is a soldier. If there was a war, he would have to bear marching and thirstiness and perhaps deep wounds. And he would never say a word, not one word." Ermengarde could only gaze at her, but she felt that she was beginning to adore her. She was so wonderful and different from anyone else. Presently, she lifted her face and shook back her black locks with a queer smile. "If I go on talking and talking," she said, "and telling you things about pretending, I shall bear it better. You don't forget. You bear it better." Ermengarde did not know why a lump came to her throat, and her eyes felt as if tears were in them. "Lavinia and Jessie are best friends," she said rather huskily. "I wish we could be best friends. Would you have me for yours? You're clever, and I'm the stupidest child in the school, but I do so like you." "I'm glad of that," said Sara. "Makes you thankful when you are liked. Yes, we will be friends. And I'll tell you what," a sudden gleam lighting her face, "I can help you with your French lessons." All right. And for now,